Hey everybody, it's a rainy Tuesday morning and I've been down here in the fish room sort of tidying up, topping off my jars of food, and I remembered that recently one of my viewers asked me if I would shoot a video about all the various foods I use and how I feed each tank and so on and so forth. So we're going to start by going over to my workstation where I've got most of the foods that I use laid out, and we're going to look at them, have a little chat about each and every food, and then we will come back and we'll look at tank to tank and we'll talk about how we feed each tank, my thoughts on the kinds of foods I'm using and feeding them, why I use those foods, and so on and so forth. So let's get on over to the workstation and take a look at what I've actually got laid out so far. Alright, so this is most of the foods I use, and it's the prepared foods that I'm talking specifically about right now. I do grow snails, and we have live plants in the tank, and so on and so forth. But my prepared foods are pretty much as follows. I've got Marine Land, color enhancing flakes. I have a smaller jar. I just use this to top it off and refill it. That is my probably main staple food that I feed the most to my fish. I've also got the color enhancing floating cichlid pellets, more or less the same thing. I do have some tetra cichlid pellets, but I don't use these very often. Nobody really seems to like these too much. I've actually had this container for quite a while and I've never really gone through it. I've also got freeze-dried krill. I try to buy in bulk because I go through quite a lot of food. I have Daphnia. I have omega-1 shrimp pellets. These are another very common food I use. I have omega-1 tubifex worms. These are little cubes. You can stick them to the glass. What I usually do is soak them in water and get the cubes broken up to individual worms and then pour it in. They will float on the surface though, so keep that in mind. This is a new one that I've just got, so I don't really have a lot to say about this one just yet. It is Sarah Onip, and these also stick to the glass and are treats for fish. These are supposed to be very high quality. These were recommended to me, so we'll see how those go in the future. I haven't really used them yet. These are Hikari algae wafers. Again, I just buy it by the kilo, but most people will probably be familiar with the small silver packages that are 8 or 12 ounces or something like that. This is 2.2 pounds of them, and I am running kind of low, so I'm going to be needing to reorder them fairly soon. I got frozen mysis shrimp. This is just a container. I have the actual frozen shrimp upstairs in the freezer. But that is mysis shrimp, and these are, of course, frozen bloodworms. Again, the bloodworms themselves are in the freezer. This is another staple food for certain fish. So that's all of the prepared foods that I use on a regular basis. So let's go back over to the tanks and we'll have a look at what I use the different foods for and who eats what and so on and so forth. Alright, let's start with my 29-gallon miscellaneous tank. My main staple food, as I was just saying, is my color enhancing flakes. Pretty much every tank gets a sprinkle of those once a day for main feeding, this tank included. I also will then break up an algae wafer and put it into the bottom of the tank so that the rubber lip pleco and all of the little loaches I have down on the bottom absolutely love those Hikari algae wafers, and they just tear them up and devour them. From time to time, I will put treats in the tank, as with all of my tanks. I'll occasionally put some bloodworms in here. I'll occasionally put some tubifex or something like that. About once or twice a week, I will put, I don't know, maybe a dozen of those little shrimp pellets in there instead of the algae wafers, and that gives all of my bottom dwellers a little bit of an extra protein meal. And shrimp pellets are actually good for color enhancing as well. So once or twice a week they get shrimp pellets on the bottom. Almost every day they get broken up Hikari algae wafers, and then of course the flake food for all of the surface feeders and the mid column, and of course the angelfish and everybody else will go to the bottom to eat those Hikari algae wafers. Everybody loves those. This tank is pretty much the same routine. Again, that's pretty much the routine in most of my tanks. So let's, rather than go over every tank that I do the same thing with, let's talk about some of the differences in some of the tanks. This one, I tend to put a larger amount of algae wafers in it because I've got a fairly large catfish on the bottom that comes out for the algae wafers. You can see him hiding down there in the corner, my striped Raphael. I have a lot of loaches in here and other bottom-dwelling type fish. So I tend to try to get a lot of the algae wafers in this tank. I also have a lot of off-walks grazing fish in this tank. And if you'll notice, there's not a ton of off-walks on everything. They do a really good job of keeping the tank clean, but as a result, I've got to make sure they get plenty of supplemental food that they can't get from the natural sources in the tank. So that's what I want to point out with this tank. This tank has a lot of natural food sources in it. I have the off-walks grazers, such as this Hillstream loach right here you can see on the glass. It's grazing on off-walks right now. I've got Otocinclus in here. I've got a rubber-lip pleco. All of these fish find natural food sources in the tank. They scrape this wood and they eat the algae and the off-walks growing on the wood. And then, of course, the gouramis are notorious for being mostly vegetarian. They will eat insects and meatier foods, but mostly they eat plant material. So they absolutely devour and destroy my root system and all of the new growth on my floating water sprite here. So I keep that in mind. When I'm feeding this tank, I try to remember what is in there naturally that already gives them a food source, because you cannot feed a fish a whole lot but still be overfeeding the tank if the tank is already providing the fish with a lot of natural food sources. So just keep that in mind. My angelfish tank, this one is similar, but the off-walks grazing fish in this tank is limited to one, but it is a Chinese algae eater. It's a pretty big fish, and they also tend to need a meatier diet. Despite the fact that they're an off-walks grazing fish, they will attach to my angelfish and try to get the slime coat if they're not getting enough protein in their diet. So this tank, on about 3 days a week, I make sure I put a fair amount of those shrimp pellets in there that sink to the bottom. And as long as I continue to do that, the Chinese algae eater leaves my angelfish alone, and then it goes around and just scours the tank. So again, I do put algae wafers in this tank pretty much every day, and then of course the floating color enhancing flakes that I put in, or they float sort of, and they swirl around in the water column if you swish them through the tank, but they're not sinking, is my point. So all of these other fish, these little mid-column fish, eat the flakes as their sort of main staple food, and then of course I do the algae wafers and the shrimp pellets on the bottom. Treats, just like any other tank. The mysis shrimp would be treats. Occasionally I'll put bloodworms in there. From time to time I'll put the Daphnia in there. I really got the Daphnia because I had a fish that I thought was constipated, and I thought the Daphnia would help get things moving, so to speak, and it turns out the fish was not constipated, but I now have Daphnia, so that does get fed to the fish as a treat from time to time. This tank is not really much different, but I do have a black ghost knife fish in this tank, so I need to make sure stuff gets on the bottom, and I need to make sure meatier stuff gets on the bottom because of the dietary needs of the fish. It's a hunter. In the wild, it eats worms and little crustaceans, small fish, things like that from the bottom. So I need to make sure I get some shrimp pellets down on the bottom. Occasionally I do bloodworms, like last night, for example. I put bloodworms in there. I actually have, right here as a matter of fact, I actually have a piece of PVC pipe with a bend on the end. I can put it in and actually line it up so that and then pour bloodworms down the top of it, and it will actually deposit the bloodworms right into his little cave there in the bottom. So I make sure he gets the kind of meatier food that he needs. This tank is the same way. I have some fish in here. The darters on the bottom, for example, are bottom feeders and they're little meat eaters. So I make sure I do the same thing. I use this pipe and I will dump down into this little nook and down into here. I will make sure I get bloodworms down in there so that all of these fish don't get to them, but the bottom dwelling fish do. And my little brown guy in here, my little warmouth sunfish, has already learned that this means feeding time, and it will actually swim up and wait right in front of the opening for the worms to start flowing out, and it gobbles them up. I've also noticed that that one has begun eating the flake color enhancing flakes that I've been putting in there. This tank is also a little different because it is a native tank, and you might wonder how well these fish do with prepared foods. These fish do fine with prepared foods. I had an issue with my larger sunfish, the bluegill that hides down here in the corner. It took a couple of days for it to get hungry enough, but once it finally started eating some flake, it was on it. And now it eats flake, it eats the floating food, it eats pretty much anything, and it has already also learned that I'm the food source, and when I come up and start putting food in, it comes right out and comes over. So that took all of about 4 days to get that fish eating prepared food. As far as what I feed this tank, it's pretty much the same thing. I do the color enhancing flakes, which is sort of an all-around dietary food for most fish, and we will talk about that in a minute. I put algae wafers on the bottom for the crayfish, for the darters. The sunfish will even go down to the bottom. These minnows over here, these golden shiners, will go down to the bottom and peck at the algae wafers. And then, of course, I make sure I put shrimp pellets in there. This tank needs a little higher food than other tanks. All of these are river and stream fish. They have much higher metabolisms, and they are very active. They're in a heavy current. They're just, they're burning more calories. They're doing more stuff. So just like you or me, if we had a really busy, active day, we need more food for more energy to be able to do that stuff. So this tank tends to get a little more well-fed than some of my others, but the food products are basically the same. Just because it's a native tank, I haven't really gone out of my way to give them necessarily native food. This is my snail tank. I actually breed snails in here for the purposes of feeding my fish. I have 2 tanks that have puffers in them, and puffers need to eat the snails, and I also throw these snails in the native tank we were just looking at for those darters on the bottom, so they have a natural food source as well. And then this tank, pretty much the same routine, nothing special here. This is the drawer where I keep all of my foods and stuff. And then my 125 is pretty much the same too. I don't really do anything special with this tank. I make sure I get algae wafers on the bottom, make sure I get shrimp on the bottom. Occasionally I'd give the treats, etc., etc. So that's about the long and short of all the various foods I use and why I use them. So let's talk just a little bit about my philosophy on foods. I know some of the foods we just looked at a little while ago were not the highest quality. I had some Tetra flakes over there, or some Tetra something or other over there. I think the Tetra was the one that the fish don't particularly like, and I don't feed very often. But even the Marineland, by some people's standards, is a sort of lower quality food. I know there's some people out there who are real sticklers about feeding their fish the highest quality food possible, and there's plenty of good reason to do that. It's lower residue in your tank, it's higher yield for your fish, you get good color, and so on and so forth. But I've never had anybody complain about my fish being not colorful or shiny enough. I've never had anybody complain about my fish being too small, not growing very well, or any other issues that would be food related. So I tend to think of the food the same way I think of my own food or my dog or my cats. And that is, yes, I know that you can buy dog food that's $25 for a little, 5-pound bag of it, and it's probably healthier for your dog. But you know what? I'm not going to spend $25 for a little 5-pound bag of dog food for my dog. I don't really know what that would do in the long run, but I buy my dog decent food. I don't buy the cheap no-name brand crap. I don't buy the stuff that's all full of fillers. But I don't buy enormously expensive food either. And I do the same thing for myself. I eat decent food, but I'm not crazy about it. I don't eat nothing but health food. In fact, I actually have vast room for improvement in my own personal diet, as anybody that knows me can attest. But I feel the same way about fish. I feed them well. I feed them a good variety of food. I feed them good, decent quality stuff. I do in the summertime go out and get crickets and different bugs and insects from the yard. Some people will say not to do that because you never know what you're going to be bringing in and what kind of pesticides or whatever. it's my yard. I don't spray pesticides in my yard. If you live in an apartment complex or something where they come around and they treat your property, well, don't use them. You know, if you live near the city or something. I live where nobody sprays anything in my yard or anywhere near it, and any bugs or insects in my yard, any worms that I collect out of my mulch pile in my yard, they just live in that mulch pile. It's mine, and I know there's no chemicals or anything in it. So I've never worried about using live food from out in the yard either, going around and collecting crickets or earthworms or what have you. So again, I do give my fish good quality food, and I try to give them good, well-rounded diets, but I'm not crazy about it. I don't get all hung up on making sure I've got absolutely top-notch, best everything. Again, I know that some people will disagree with that. Some people have a different philosophy, and that's fine. You're certainly welcome to disagree with me. If you want to put your comments down below, I would love to hear them. You know, I'd like to hear your reasoning for using the really high-quality food and what the payoff is, and, you know, advantages and so on and so forth. My philosophy is that, like with my dog or my cats, as I was saying, am I going to get an extra 2 months of life at the end of their lifespan because I've spent $25 on a 5-pound bag of food? Or am I not going to notice the difference when you really get right down to it in the long run? And I just don't really think it's completely worth it. I just, you know, like I said, I just sort of give them the good high quality stuff. I give them a good varied diet, and I just don't really worry that much about it. So if you thought some of that food was a little lower quality, that's my philosophy on it. Again, yours may be different. But that's more or less my feeding routine. I will say one last thing. I did get asked about my bumblebee gobies in this tank with my puffer. They may be finicky eaters, I don't know, but Butterbean here, my figure 8 puffer, is such a messy eater. When he eats the snails, bits of snail go everywhere. When he eats the freeze-dried krill I put in there, bits of krill go everywhere. And the figure 8s, I mean the bumblebee gobies, get plenty of food by just from him eating. So a lot of times I don't even feed them directly. I just feed Butterbean, and then they get some leftovers. If I feed Butterbean something like bloodworms, then they get the bloodworms themselves. They absolutely love bloodworms. They'll eat flake food. About once a week, I will take some of those color-enhancing flakes and I'll crumple up real small, and just to put just a little bit, just a pinch in the tank, and they'll go around and get it and nibble it up. I did have a little shrimp in here. Don't know if he's still in there or not, but I also put a little bit of flake food in the tank for the shrimp to eat too. But this tank has a lot of off-walks and algae and other natural food sources that the shrimp would eat. So again, always keep that in mind and take that into consideration too. Are there any natural food sources in your tank, and how much of it is your fish consuming? You know, so how much do you need to supplement? Anyway, there's my around-the-world food tour, I guess you could call it. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please subscribe. Make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss anything I got coming up. It's going to be a rainy day, so I've probably got a few more videos coming out today alone. Thanks again for watching. See you real soon in the next one.